People like him never buy anything worth more than a couple of dollars. He's just wasting our time." That was the sentence, sharp and cruel, whispered by a young employee who thought no one important was listening. A sentence that cuts like a knife and sets the stage for what you are about to hear. Before I take you deeper into this unbelievable true-to-life story, drop your city in the comments, subscribe, and like if you believe in fairness and dignity now. Let us go back to that Saturday morning in Houston, Texas, when David Harper, the CEO and founder of Harper Retail Group, worth over $4 billion in market valuation, walked into one of his own superstores Undercover. David had built this empire from nothing, starting from a corner store in Atlanta nearly 20 years ago. He had promised himself back then that no customer, no matter their color, their clothes, or the size of their wallet, would ever feel dismissed or unwanted inside a Harper Mart. But complaints had been piling up, quiet at first, then louder, and then unavoidable. Customers had written in about being ignored, spoken down to, or even openly disrespected. David was a man who believed in solving problems at the root, and so on this bright autumn morning, he chose to put away the tailored suits and silk ties, and instead wore a plain gray hoodie, faded jeans, and old sneakers, just like any other man walking in from the parking lot. He pulled the brim of his baseball cap lower, slung a worn canvas bag over his shoulder, and prepared himself for what was coming. Inside the store, everything seemed fine on the surface. The air was cool, the shelves were neatly stocked, cashiers were busy ringing up purchases, children laughed as their parents wheeled carts past the toy aisle. To any casual observer, Harper Mart #118 was thriving. But David had not come to glance at appearances. He had come to listen, to feel, to put himself in the shoes of the ordinary customer. And the truth was about to reveal itself in the harshest way. As he walked slowly through the aisles, he noticed some workers busy with purpose. One young Latina woman folding clothes smiled and greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Let me know if you need anything." Her name tag read, Olivia. David returned the smile, grateful, though he said nothing yet. But then he reached the electronics section, and what happened there would stay with him forever. A young man named Kyle leaned against the counter, head down, scrolling endlessly on his phone. David lifted a pair of headphones from the shelf, turning the box in his hands, waiting to be noticed. Nothing. Kyle did not even glance up. Minutes passed. David cleared his throat softly, then placed the box on the counter in plain sight. At last, Kyle raised his eyes, but his face carried no warmth, no respect, only boredom. "Can I help you?" he muttered, voice flat, dripping with indifference. David, calm as ever, smiled politely. "Yes. Could you tell me if these speakers are good for outdoor use?" Kyle sighed, rolled his eyes, turned the box over as if burdened by the weight of such a small request, then shoved it back across the counter. "Says weatherproof. You can read it yourself." Still composed, David asked, "And are they compatible with most devices?" That was when Kyle's mask dropped. His eyes hardened, his mouth twisted into disdain, and he said, "Look, man, all the details are right there. You can figure it out or pick something else. Doesn't matter to me." The words hung in the air like poison. David felt the sting deep inside, but worse was yet to come, because just then, another customer walked into the same section, a white man in his 50s named James Walker, a businessman in the area. Kyle's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He straightened his back, pocketed his phone, smiled wide, and hurried toward James with an eager tone. "Welcome, sir. Let me show you our newest models. You'll love this one for your home theater." David stood silently, invisible in plain sight, watching the contrast, The very same employee who could not spare him 2 honest sentences was now overflowing with courtesy toward someone else. It was not laziness. It was choice. And it was ugly. David's heart tightened. He turned away, pretending to browse. But what he heard next would confirm everything. Kyle had joined another worker named Mark near the home goods aisle. David, only steps away, caught their hushed voices. Mark chuckled. That guy back there, the one in the hoodie, he's just looking. People like him don't buy big stuff. Kyle laughed softly. Yeah, total waste of time. Just let him wander. And then came the words that opened this story. Words that made David's blood run cold. People like him never buy anything worth more than a couple of dollars. In that moment, David was no longer just undercover. He was a black man being judged, dismissed, and devalued, right inside the walls of the company he had built to represent respect. He clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his bag and wrote it down. Every word, because he knew this was not an isolated slip of the tongue. It was a symptom of something larger, something rotting beneath the surface of his empire. He thought of the early days, when he had trained each employee himself, reminding them that dignity was not negotiable. How far had things drifted since then? David moved toward the registers, where he met Angela Brooks, a black woman in her 40s with a kind face. She greeted him warmly. "Did you find everything okay today?" He answered softly. "Not exactly, but thank you." Her professionalism eased the sting for a moment, but his mind was racing. Some employees embodied the values he once set in stone, others trampled them, and so, standing there with a plastic bag in his hand and a storm in his chest. David Harper knew this undercover visit was not just an experiment. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would shake his company, his staff, and even the wider world, because what he had just endured was bigger than a pair of speakers. It was about dignity, about bias, and about the soul of his brand. And David Harper was not a man who turned away from the truth. David Harper stood in the electronics aisle, still holding the sting of those words. His heartbeat steady, but his mind sharp, refusing to let anger take control. Because what mattered now was clarity, not rage. He decided to give Kyle, the young employee who had brushed him off, one more chance to show even a shred of professionalism. Slowly, he picked up a boxed Bluetooth speaker and placed it gently on the counter. Waiting. Kyle looked up again, his eyes heavy with irritation, as if David's very presence was an inconvenience. "Yeah, what do you need?" he muttered, voice low but dripping with disdain. David kept his tone calm, polite, even warm, though every fiber in him wanted to challenge the arrogance head-on. "Could you tell me if this is compatible with most devices?" Kyle exhaled sharply, grabbed the box without care, flipped it around and tossed it back. "It's on the box. Man, just read it. Everything you need is right there." He then turned his gaze back to his phone, as though the conversation had already ended. David did not move. He stood there silently, not with shock anymore, but with a quiet sadness that cut deeper than anger. This was his store, his creation, his brand. And here he was being treated as though he did not matter at all. Just then, fate gave him the cruelest comparison. Another customer entered the same aisle, James Walker, a well-known businessman in the Houston area. James wore a crisp white shirt, dark slacks, and expensive shoes. And without hesitation, Kyle slipped his phone into his pocket, straightened his back, and transformed his entire demeanor. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Harper Mart. How can I help you today?" Kyle's voice was suddenly cheerful, warm, even enthusiastic. He rushed forward, grabbed a different set of speakers from the display, and began explaining every detail: sound quality, warranty, Bluetooth range, even recommending which ones would fit best for a backyard party. James nodded, impressed, and smiled at the attention. David stood just steps away, watching the performance, his chest tightening with each word. The same employee who could not spare him 10 seconds of courtesy was now overflowing with charm and eagerness for a customer who looked, at least in Kyle's eyes, like someone who mattered. The hypocrisy was blatant. David turned his face slightly, pretending to study a row of headphones. But inside his thoughts raced. He wondered how many other customers had walked these aisles, dressed simply, perhaps carrying the wrong skin color, and left with the same bitter taste he now carried. How many had gone home with nothing but frustration, not because of the products, but because of the way they were treated as less than. This was no small oversight. This was culture. This was bias that had been allowed to grow. David's memories carried him back decades, to that painful day in Atlanta as a teenager when he had been laughed at in a clothing store for not affording a jacket. The sting of humiliation burning in his chest until he swore that one day he would build a place where no one felt that shame again. And yet, here he was, in his own store, feeling that exact same sting. He forced his expression to remain neutral, refusing to give Kyle the satisfaction of seeing his disappointment. But inside, the reckoning had already begun. He could not and would not allow this to stand. He waited as James completed his purchase, listening to Kyle's exaggerated compliments and cheerful farewell. Then, as the businessman walked away satisfied, Kyle leaned against the counter once more, pulling his phone out as if nothing had happened. That was when David decided to step back, not because he was finished, but because he wanted to see if the pattern was consistent. He moved away from electronics and toward the home goods section. There he overheard Kyle once again, this time joined by Mark Reynolds, a stock worker leaning casually against a shelf. Their voices were low, but David, standing only a few steps away pretending to examine a set of pots and pans, caught every word. "That guy in the hoodie," Kyle whispered with a smirk. "Just walking around, wasting time. People like him never buy anything big." Mark chuckled. "Yeah, probably doesn't even have the cash for this stuff. Let him wander. Not worth our time." The words were careless, spoken without a thought, as if dismissing customers was as natural as breathing. And once again, they cut into David's chest, not just as a man, but as the founder who had always believed his company would be different. He clenched his jaw, his notebook still in his pocket, and silently wrote down every phrase. These were not isolated mistakes. This was proof, yet as heavy as the moment was. Hope flickered in the next aisle, because not every employee reflected this poison. David's steps took him into the clothing section where Olivia Carter, the young Latina he had seen earlier, was patiently helping an elderly man. The old customer struggled to find the right size, fumbling with shirts, looking embarrassed. Olivia's smile never wavered. She guided him gently, suggested a matching tie, and when the man finally smiled back with gratitude, it reminded David why he had built Harper Mart in the first place. Compassion, respect, service. That was the vision. And while Kyle and Mark's behavior felt like betrayal, Olivia was the proof that the vision had not died completely. David's chest eased for a moment, but he knew that isolated kindness was not enough. The problem was larger, systemic, and it demanded action. He could not confront them yet, not until he had seen everything he needed to see. And so he walked toward the checkout lanes, holding his head high, even as his heart carried the weight of disappointment. At the front, he met Angela Brooks, the middle-aged black cashier with warm eyes and a steady voice. "Did you find everything okay today?" she asked with sincerity. David replied softly, "Not exactly, but thank you." Her professionalism was real, not forced, and for the briefest moment, He felt reassured. Yet as he walked out of the store into the parking lot, his steps were heavy. The truth was undeniable. In 1 hour, he had seen both the best and the worst of his company, and as the sun bore down on the concrete. David Harper knew one thing for certain. The reckoning had just begun. David Harper lingered in the home goods aisle, his hand resting lightly on the handle of a skillet, though his attention was fixed on the two employees only a few feet away, Kyle Dawson and Mark Reynolds, who spoke in hushed tones yet with a confidence that revealed how often they let words like these slip unchecked. "That guy in the hoodie," Kyle muttered, jerking his chin toward David without realizing who he was. "He's not buying anything. People like him don't have money for the real stuff." Mark chuckled, leaning lazily against a shelf stacked with pots and pans. "Yeah, I've seen it 100 times. They walk around, touch everything, ask questions, but they never spend. Not worth it. Better focus on the ones who actually matter." David stood frozen, not with shock but with a cold clarity that settled in his chest. He had come undercover for answers, and now the answers were louder than he had ever expected. It was not a single careless employee or a moment of impatience. It was an attitude, a mindset that had been allowed to root itself deep inside his company, an infection spreading quietly, showing its face only when no one of authority was watching. David reached into his canvas bag, pulled out his small notebook, and wrote the words down exactly as he heard them. He did not confront them. Not yet. Because instinct told him this was bigger than two men gossiping. This was culture, and culture did not grow by accident. It grew because managers ignored it or enabled it. As he scribbled, David noticed movement at the edge of his vision. Angela Brooks, the cashier he had met earlier, was pushing an empty cart back toward her station, and she too had caught the tail end of what Kyle and Mark had said. For a moment their eyes met, hers filled with quiet recognition, but then she lowered her gaze quickly and kept walking. David understood. He could see the calculation in her silence. She had likely heard things like this before, maybe even experienced them directly, but speaking up would put her job at risk, and she had probably learned to swallow the pain to keep a paycheck steady. David's heart ached for her, because he knew the burden of silence, and he knew it was unfair to expect employees like Angela to fight a system when management itself might be complicit. He wrote another note in his book, not just about the employee's words, but about Angela's hesitation, because it was just as telling. People who are silenced by fear are just as much a symptom of sickness as the ones who spread it. He moved slowly to another section, pretending to browse. But inside his mind, everything was accelerating. He thought of the letters he had read late at night, customers saying they felt invisible, customers who had promised never to return. And suddenly, those words had faces. Kyle sneering, Mark chuckling, Angela lowering her eyes, Olivia working hard to do the right thing yet overshadowed by the rot around her. He could not escape the weight of realization, the growth of Harper Mart, the rapid expansion that had taken his chain from a handful of stores to more than 200 nationwide, had created cracks where the values he built on were leaking away. He remembered the early days when he personally trained every new hire, standing in the break room of his first store, telling them that every customer mattered, that respect was the foundation of service, not profit. He remembered the pride when the first loyal customer came back simply because she had been greeted with kindness. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been diluted, managers chosen for efficiency rather than integrity, numbers prioritized over people. David's throat tightened as he thought. Is this my failure? Did I trust too much? Delegate too soon? Let others guard the flame until it nearly went out? He kept walking, watching from a distance as Kyle and Mark carried on their lazy conversation, laughing about which customers they considered worth the effort. Every laugh was another nail in the coffin of what Harper Mart was supposed to represent. He could have confronted them on the spot, revealed himself, and demanded an explanation. But he chose patience. He needed to see how deep this ran. And he needed the others in this store, the good ones like Olivia and Angela, to witness the truth with their own eyes when the time came. His strategy was already forming. He would gather them, all of them, and show them what had been allowed to happen under their roof. But for now, he let the employees' own words condemn them. David stepped toward the checkout area again, this time observing the flow of customers. He saw a young mother with 2 children struggling with heavy bags, and no one moved to help until Olivia rushed over, leaving her station in clothing just long enough to lend a hand. He saw a white couple near the front receiving cheerful assistance from another worker who had earlier ignored him completely. The inconsistency was glaring, the pattern undeniable. Those who looked the part were served with smiles. Those who did not were left invisible. And David, standing as both witness and victim, felt the contradiction tear at his chest. He pulled his notebook close, whispering softly to himself as he wrote, "This is not about one bad apple. This is a broken branch. If I let it stand, the whole tree will rot." His pen pressed harder into the paper, underlining words with deliberate force, as if engraving them into his memory. He knew by the end of this day, by the end of this undercover mission, lives would change. Some would rise, some would fall. But the culture of Harper Mart would no longer be left to chance. And as he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his bag, he exhaled slowly, feeling the shift inside him. The disappointment was still raw, but now it was welded to determination. The reckoning would not be delayed. It would start here, in this very store, with the very employees who thought he was just another man in a hoodie. David Harper moved slowly toward the clothing section, notebook heavy in his pocket, his mind still echoing with the poisonous laughter of Kyle and Mark. But what he saw next reminded him that even in darkness, light can still survive. There, standing beside a rack of men's dress shirts, was Olivia Carter, a young Latina in her late 20s, her uniform neat, her posture attentive, and her face warm with a genuine smile. She was speaking softly to an elderly man, his hands trembling as he fumbled with a hanger. The man's voice was weak, almost apologetic. "I can't find the right size, and I don't want to bother anyone." Olivia leaned closer, her tone gentle but firm. "Sir, you are never a bother. Let's find the perfect fit for you." She guided him with patience, lifting each shirt carefully, holding them against his shoulders, asking him about his comfort, and even suggesting a tie that would bring out the color of his eyes. The old man's expression softened, his shoulders straightened, and when she placed the right size into his cart, he reached for her hand with gratitude. "Thank you, young lady," he whispered. "You made this easier than I ever expected." Olivia smiled again, a smile so genuine that even David, watching silently from a distance, felt it heal a small piece of the wound that had been growing inside him all morning. His chest tightened, not from anger this time, but from memory. Because in that moment he was no longer a CEO undercover in Houston. He was a 15-year-old boy in Atlanta, standing inside a department store decades ago, clutching a worn jacket he could barely afford, listening to the cashier laugh under her breath and say to another worker, "Why bother with him? He can't pay anyway." That humiliation had burned so deeply that it became fuel for everything that followed. The determination to build a company where no child, no man, no woman would ever feel that sting again. And yet here he was, reliving the same pain, not from strangers, but from his own staff. The contrast was jarring. Olivia's kindness reminded him of the dream. Kyle and Mark's cruelty reminded him of the nightmare. He wiped the corner of his eye quickly, hiding the moisture that had risen there, and scribbled into his notebook, "This is what Harper Mart should look like. Compassion, dignity, service," as he stood watching. Another customer approached Olivia, a young mother with a toddler tugging at her hand and frustration clear in her eyes. Olivia immediately crouched down to smile at the child, easing his restlessness, then rose to help the mother find what she needed, all the while keeping her tone calm, patient, and reassuring. It was not just work for her, it was care. And David knew in that instant that she represented the very heartbeat of the company he once envisioned. He moved on toward the checkout lanes, feeling the weight of contradictions pressing on him. There was rot, yes, but there was also resilience. The question was whether the resilience could be nurtured before the rot consumed everything. At the registers, he once again saw Angela Brooks. Her line was long, customers tired, children restless, but her voice remained steady and her face composed. "Did you find everything all right today?" she asked each person with the same warmth. Some barely acknowledged her. Others smiled and thanked her. But she never faltered. When it was David's turn, she looked him in the eye and repeated the same question. "Did you find everything okay?" And he answered softly, "Not exactly, but thank you for asking." Her smile dipped for a moment, sensing something in his tone, but she nodded with quiet dignity and continued her work. David carried that moment with him as he stepped away, because in Angela he saw endurance. She had likely endured slights, overheard disrespect, maybe even been targeted herself, but she still chose to serve with pride, even when others around her dragged the culture down. It was women like Angela, workers like Olivia, who gave him hope that the heart of Harper Mart had not fully died. Yet hope was not enough. He felt the urgency building inside his chest, the quiet storm that had been gathering since he first walked into this store. His thoughts turned to Tracy Miller, the floor manager on duty, the woman responsible for supervising this shift, for guiding these employees. Where was she when Kyle ignored him? When Mark laughed at him? When customers like James Walker were served like royalty while others were brushed aside? Where was leadership when Angela lowered her gaze out of fear? When Olivia carried the weight of decency alone? He knew the answer. And the answer was damning. Leadership was absent. Leadership had failed. And that failure was on him as much as it was on them, because he had allowed distance to grow between himself and the daily reality of his stores. He clenched his fists lightly, then relaxed them, reminding himself that anger without direction was useless. He would not lash out blindly. He would build a plan. He would confront the rot, and he would lift up the light. That was his responsibility as founder, as leader, as man. As he walked slowly back through the aisles one more time, past the shelves of neatly folded shirts and stacked kitchenware, he could feel the duality of his empire pressing on him. On one side, kindness, compassion, professionalism. People like Olivia and Angela. On the other, arrogance, laziness, cruelty. People like Kyle and Mark. Which side would define Harper Mart? That was the question, and he already knew the answer had to be chosen deliberately. He paused at the automatic doors, the cool air of the store giving way to the heavy warmth of the Texas sun outside. For a moment he stood still, gripping the strap of his canvas bag, staring at the parking lot as customers streamed in and out. He knew he could walk away, chalk this up as another disappointing experience, make notes for later. But his soul told him otherwise. This was not a time for later. This was a time for now. He turned back, walked firmly toward the customer service desk, and asked to see the manager. Within minutes, Tracy Miller would appear, confident, composed, perhaps believing she had control of this store. But David Harper was done observing. He was ready to act, and the reckoning that had been building all morning was about to begin. Tracy Miller walked briskly toward the customer service desk, her name badge shining under the store lights, her expression polite but guarded. The practiced face of a manager who believed she could handle anything. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her was not just another customer, but the founder of everything around her. "How can I help you today, sir?" she asked with a professional smile, though her eyes flicked briefly toward his plain hoodie and worn jeans. A flicker of judgment she did not bother to hide. David Harper extended his hand calmly and said, "My name is David Harper, and I'd like to talk to you about what I've experienced in your store this morning." Tracy hesitated, her eyes narrowing at the name, a faint spark of recognition crossing her face before she quickly brushed it aside. To her, this was just another customer with a complaint, and complaints were things to deflect, smooth over, and move past as quickly as possible. "Of course, Mr. Harper," she replied with a slight nod. "If something wasn't up to your expectations, I can assure you we'll look into it." Her tone was courteous but hollow, the kind of voice used to placate, not to listen. David's voice remained steady as he described the indifference at the electronics counter, the dismissive tone when he asked simple questions, and the hushed comments he overheard in the home goods aisle, words that cut to the bone not just as a customer, but as a man. Tracy nodded occasionally, her arms crossed lightly, her expression suggesting she had heard complaints before and considered them exaggerations. "Sometimes employees have off days," she said, "and customers may misinterpret things. We always do our best, but you know, no team is perfect." David's eyes sharpened, his calm voice carrying a new weight. "This was not a misinterpretation. This was contempt, and I can prove it." He reached into his bag and produced his phone, pressing play on the recording he had made. The voices filled the air, clear and unmistakable. Kyle's sneer, Mark's chuckle, and the cruel sentence that had burned itself into David's memory. "People like him never buy anything worth more than a couple of dollars." The sound hung in the space between them, undeniable, irrefutable. And Tracy's face shifted instantly, her practiced calm faltering, her lips parting slightly as the color drained from her cheeks. For the first time, her eyes betrayed fear, not for David, but for herself, for the store, for the chain of command that she realized in that moment she might not control anymore. Before she could gather a defense, Angela Brooks, who had quietly approached from her register, stepped closer. Her voice was soft at first, but clear, trembling with both fear and courage. "I heard it too," she said. "I didn't want to cause trouble, but I heard exactly what they said about him, and it wasn't right." Silence fell for a moment as Tracy turned toward her, eyes sharp, the subtle warning of a manager who had long relied on intimidation to keep subordinates quiet. But Angela did not step back this time. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steadier now. "I have worked here for 8 years, and I've seen things brushed under the rug too many times. But not today. Not with this." David looked at Angela with gratitude, a small nod that told her she was not alone anymore, that her words mattered. Tracy swallowed hard, her composure unraveling. She tried once more, reaching for excuses. "We'll handle this internally. Mr. Harper, I can assure you disciplinary action will be considered, but please understand, this doesn't reflect the majority of our team." David shook his head slowly, his eyes locked on hers, his voice now firm enough to carry across the desk to the employees within earshot. "You don't understand who you are speaking to. Tracy, I am not just a customer with a complaint. I am David Harper, the founder and CEO of Harper Retail Group. This store, this brand, this company, carries my name. And what I saw today, what I heard today, is the opposite of everything I built this company to represent." The words hit like thunder. Tracy's mouth opened slightly, then closed, her body rigid, as murmurs rippled through the nearby staff who had begun to notice the confrontation. Angela's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth as shock turned into a kind of quiet pride. She had spoken up at the moment that mattered most. David continued, his tone calm but unyielding, the voice of a man who had carried disappointment into determination. This is not about one bad employee or one bad day. This is about a culture that has been allowed to decay, and that is on leadership. That is on you, Tracy. And if you think I am going to walk out of here and let this slide, you don't know me. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and Tracy's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of her position bore down. David straightened, his notebook still tucked under his arm, and spoke with finality. Gather the staff, all of them, right now. We are going to address this together. His tone left no room for argument, and Tracy, realizing she was no longer in control, nodded stiffly and moved to comply. Angela exhaled, a shaky breath of relief and vindication, and for the first time that day, David felt the shift in the air. The reckoning he had come to find was no longer just his private mission. It was about to become public, undeniable, and transformative. And as employees began to stir, called to the break room, David Harper knew that the moment of truth had arrived, the moment when the masks would fall and the real culture of Harper Mart would be laid bare in front of every eye that had chosen to look away until now. The break room filled quickly, chairs scraping against the floor, voices hushed as employees shuffled inside, some curious, some anxious, others unaware of the storm about to break. David Harper stood at the front, his plain hoodie and jeans still disguising him as any ordinary man, but his posture now carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Tracy Miller stood stiffly off to the side, her face pale, knowing the control she once had was slipping with every passing second. Kyle Dawson slouched in the back, phone in his hand until a sharp look from Tracy made him slide it into his pocket, while Mark Reynolds leaned against the wall with a smirk that had not yet faded, confident that this was just another complaint that would blow over. Angela Brooks sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart racing, but her eyes steady, knowing she had chosen to speak the truth. Olivia Carter, still smelling faintly of fabric softener from the clothing aisle, slipped quietly into a chair, her expression cautious but hopeful, when the room had settled. David raised his voice, firm but not loud, the kind of tone that commands silence without force. "Good afternoon," he began, and the murmur of conversation died instantly. "Some of you don't know me. Some of you think I am just another shopper who wandered in. But today, you're going to hear the truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting each pair of eyes, letting the tension build until it was thick enough to cut. Then he said it. "My name is David Harper. I am the founder and CEO of Harper Retail Group. This store, this chain, this company, every brick, every product, every paycheck you hold, carries my name." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Kyle's smirk vanished. Mark straightened in disbelief, and Tracy's lips parted as if to object. But no words came. Olivia's eyes widened with shock, then softened with relief, while Angela placed a trembling hand over her chest as pride washed through her. David let the silence hang for a moment longer before continuing. "I came here today undercover, not as your boss, but as a customer. I wanted to see with my own eyes what people have been saying. I wanted to know if the values I built this company on still live in these walls." His voice hardened now, steel beneath the calm, and what I saw was not what Harper Mart is supposed to be. He turned his gaze directly toward Kyle. I saw indifference, disrespect, contempt for a man who asked a simple question. You could not be bothered to look me in the eye. You could not be bothered to treat me with the dignity every customer deserves." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. But David's words cut through the room. He turned next toward Mark. "And you, Mark, laughed as you dismissed me, judged me not by my words or actions, but by the hoodie I wore and the color of my skin. You decided I was not worth your time. That poison spreads when no one stops it." Mark's smirk collapsed into a scowl, but he said nothing, his arms folding tightly across his chest. Then David faced Tracy. "And you, Tracy, the manager on duty, chose excuses instead of accountability. You tried to tell me I misinterpreted what I heard. You tried to downplay the culture that is festering under your leadership. That is unacceptable." The room was silent except for the pounding of hearts, the realization that this was not just another meeting, but a reckoning. David straightened his shoulders and spoke with finality. "Here is what will happen. Kyle Dawson, you are terminated effective immediately. Mark Reynolds, you are terminated effective immediately. Tracy Miller, you are suspended from your position. Pending full investigation into your conduct and your history of leadership failures, security will escort you from the building today." Gasps spread across the room. Kyle's face drained of color, his mouth opening in protest only to shut again under David's unwavering gaze. Tracy's knees seemed to buckle slightly, her breath catching as the reality set in. Mark cursed under his breath, but no one moved to defend him. David's tone softened now, his eyes seeking the faces of those who had shined despite the darkness. "But not everyone here has failed. Some of you have carried the values of Harpermart in your service. Olivia Carter, I watched you treat customers with kindness, patience, and respect. You reminded me of why I built this company. Starting today, you are promoted to shift supervisor, with a raise to reflect your leadership." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, her hand covering her mouth, disbelief and gratitude overwhelming her. David turned next to Angela. "And Angela Brooks, you spoke the truth when it mattered, even when it was risky. You chose integrity over silence. Starting today, you will receive a promotion to senior cashier lead, with a raise to reflect your years of loyalty and courage." Angela's tears spilled over, her shoulders shaking with relief and pride as the room looked on, some clapping softly, others bowing their heads in shame. David raised his voice again, steady and resolute. "This is not about punishment alone. This is about rebuilding. That is why today I am launching the Harper Integrity Initiative, a $45 million program across all 214 stores nationwide. Every employee will undergo mandatory training in customer respect and bias awareness. Every store will implement an anonymous reporting system so voices can be heard without fear. And every location will be monitored by a new accountability team to ensure this culture never takes root again." The weight of his words sank deep into the room, and no one dared to look away. Some faces showed relief, others shame, but all understood the gravity. David closed his notebook, his voice soft but carrying the force of conviction. This company was built on the promise that every customer matters. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But starting today, we take it back. Starting today, Harpermart is reminded of who we are. He paused, letting the silence settle one last time, then added, "And if you cannot live by that standard, you cannot work here." The room erupted, some with applause, some with tears, some with the quiet realization that everything had just changed. And David Harper, standing in plain clothes, but with the authority of the man who built it all, knew that the reckoning had begun in earnest, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the meeting ended, the store was no longer the same place it had been that morning. The silence after David Harper's words carried more weight than any lecture could, and the consequences came swiftly. Kyle Dawson was escorted out by security, his protests echoing through the hallway, his arrogance evaporating into desperation as he realized his paycheck, his reputation, and his future in retail had all been stripped away in an instant. Mark Reynolds followed, muttering curses under his breath. His confidence shattered as customers outside the break room began whispering, recording, and posting his downfall for the world to see. Tracy Miller walked out last, her shoulders heavy, her face pale, her years of shortcuts and cover-ups finally catching up to her. She had once believed she could hide behind numbers and procedures. But now her name was tied to failure, and within days she was formally terminated after an internal investigation revealed over a dozen prior complaints she had ignored. The story did not stay within those walls. By the time the evening sun set, customers who had witnessed the confrontation had uploaded videos to social media. And within 48 hours, the clip of David Harper revealing himself as CEO had reached nearly 5 million views, spreading across Facebook, TikTok, and local news outlets. Headlines screamed the story. Undercover Black CEO exposes bias in his own store. Harper retail shakeup sends shockwaves nationwide. From hoodie to CEO, the lesson every worker must learn. Public reaction was intense. Some praised David for his courage and humility. Others demanded accountability across the entire retail industry, and countless customers shared their own stories of being dismissed, ignored, or disrespected in stores across America. Harper Mart quickly became the center of a national conversation about service, dignity, and systemic bias. Meanwhile, within the company, the Harper Integrity Initiative rolled out at full speed. $45 million were allocated to training, accountability, and technology. Every employee, from the newest cashier to the most senior manager, attended workshops that emphasized empathy, fairness, and professionalism. Anonymous reporting hotlines were established, and within weeks, dozens of hidden issues were exposed and corrected. AI-driven monitoring systems were quietly installed in key stores to detect patterns of neglect or bias, ensuring that no customer would again be invisible simply because of their appearance. While some employees resisted, many embraced the change, relieved that the values they believed in were finally being enforced with strength. Olivia Carter. Once a floor associate folding shirts quietly in the clothing aisle, became a respected shift supervisor, her calm leadership setting the tone for her team. She was later profiled in a local newspaper as the heart of Harper Mart, a symbol of how kindness could change a company. Angela Brooks, once fearful to speak, became a senior cashier lead and later a trainer for new hires. Her story of courage inspiring others to use their voices when they saw wrongs. The contrast was stark. Those who had lived the values were lifted. Those who betrayed them were gone. Kyle's name trended on social media, but not with sympathy. He became an example of arrogance undone, rejected by other retailers who wanted nothing to do with his tarnished record. Mark struggled to find new work, his online reputation stained by the video of him laughing about people like him. Tracy tried to appeal, but more evidence surfaced, and she faded into obscurity. A cautionary tale of leadership lost. 6 months later, the numbers told the story no one could ignore. Harper Mart's revenue had risen 18% compared to the prior year. Customer satisfaction surveys hit record highs, and employees reported stronger morale and trust in management. Shareholders, once nervous about the viral scandal, now celebrated the turnaround. And David Harper himself was invited to testify before Congress on the subject of racial bias in retail service. Standing in front of lawmakers in Washington, wearing a dark suit this time, he spoke not with anger, but with conviction. Bias does not always shout, he said. Sometimes it whispers in a store aisle. Sometimes it hides behind a fake smile. Sometimes it silences those who know better but fear speaking up. But bias, no matter how quiet, always costs us something: our integrity, our dignity, and our future. If we want businesses in America to thrive, We must protect not only profits but people. His words resonated across the chamber, and even news anchors who rarely covered retail gave airtime to his testimony. Customers returned to Harpermart not just for products, but for the story of change, for the reassurance that they were valued, no matter their clothes, their wallet, or their color. In Houston, at store number 118, where it had all begun, Angela and Olivia stood side by side at the front of the store one morning, greeting customers with pride, their promotions shining not in their badges, but in the respect of those they led. David visited quietly, this time not undercover, shaking their hands, thanking them again, reminding them that change always starts with someone willing to act. As he left, he looked back once more at the building that had once broken his heart and now symbolized redemption. His journey that began with a hoodie and silence had ended with reform and renewal. And as his story spread, one truth remained clear for every ear that heard it. Dignity is not a luxury. Respect is not optional. And a company built on fairness can withstand any storm. David Harper had turned a painful undercover mission into a movement, and his legacy would not just be measured in billions of dollars, but in the millions of small moments when a customer felt seen, heard, and valued inside the walls of Harpermart. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you believe fairness and respect should be protected everywhere, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story, and share it so more people can listen, reflect, and be inspired.